TRIPS agreement, it is a shorter period. So, some scholars argue that the Sri Lankan Intellectual Property Rights Act is a TRIPS plus mechanism. So, we can conclude that the Act contains comprehensive and effective provisions on enforcement in par with the requirements of the TRIPS agreement. So, basically the mechanism envisaged by the Intellectual Property Act can be divided into 4 areas: civil judicial procedures, criminal procedures, customs control, dispute resolution through Director General of Intellectual. I may not go on to discuss them because of short of time, but these are the basic mechanisms which are enumerated in the Intellectual Property Act of Sri Lanka. But now we have a comprehensive law, intellectual property law, which is in par with the international guidelines, the TRIPS agreement. That's the yardstick. But what's the real scenario in the country? Now, this particular statement by the Office of the United States Representative, which is contained in 2012 National Trade Estimate Report, would reveal the status of intellectual property enforcement in Sri Lanka. It says, weak intellectual property rights enforcement remains a problem in Sri Lanka. Piracy levels remain very high for sound recordings and software. Government use of unauthorized software remains a problem. Redress through the courts for IPR infringement is often frustrating and time-consuming process. While police can take action against counterfeiting and piracy without complaints by right holders, they rarely do so. So, you find even the government is not adhering to the provisions of the Intellectual Property Act. So, that would reveal the sincerity of the Sri Lankan legal regime in implementing the provisions of the Intellectual Property Act and giving recognition to the international standards of intellectual property. Again, there is a survey conducted by KPMG very recently. Now, that says the weak enforcement on the part of the government has been the main reason for existence of intellectual property fraud, in other words, intellectual property violations in Sri Lanka. Now, when we talk about reasons for this, or reasons for this weak enforcement of intellectual property rights, now we find there is a document or a paper presented by Dr. D.M. Karunaratne, who is the Director General of Intellectual Property in Sri Lanka, to WIPO. Now, he identifies 6 factors that have contributed to the weak enforcement of intellectual property rights in Sri Lanka. That is, poor awareness on IP and related matters among all the strata of the society, lack of training of the officers, inadequate facilities available to the enforcement agency, high cost of litigation, reluctance of owners of IP rights to get involved in litigation, disorganized owners of IP rights and consumers. But my study identified 2 core issues with regard to the weak enforcement of intellectual property rights in Sri Lanka. Now, those 2 issues are related to the concept of intellectual property. So, the theoretical concept of intellectual property and how it has been introduced into the country has created a situation where the authorities are unable to fully implement the provisions of the Intellectual Property Act in order to effectively combat with the problem of piracy and counterfeiting. 1. That is, my submission is that the concept of intellectual property is a Western notion. It is totally alien to the Sri Lankan legal system. Now, somebody may argue that intellectual property is not foreign to any nation. Yes, true. That is what the WIPO says. It's true. The concept of intellectual property may not, in the sense, what you mean by intellectual property is not alien to any nation. You find in Sri Lanka innovations, expressions, everything. But the way in which those rights are identified, the way in which protection is given to those rights is alien to most of the Asian countries. That I will discuss in detail later. Then the second one is the perception of the Intellectual Property Act as an outcome of external pressure, because now after the TRIPS agreement came into force, all the members of the World Trade Organization were obliged to have domestic laws on intellectual property which is in compliance with the TRIPS agreement. So that can be perceived as a matter of external pressure which has come into lawmaking in Sri Lanka. So that fact itself has contributed towards the weak enforcement of intellectual property in Sri Lanka. So those two matters I will just discuss in somewhat detail. Now many scholars and writers have propounded the idea that the present intellectual property regime which we have in Sri Lanka today, or in many countries, in many developing countries around the world, is a Western concept. It is alien to Sri Lanka and many Eastern countries. Particularly, a Chinese scholar submits, although the Chinese developed writing during the 3rd millennium BC and introduced paper to the world, it was not until the 1980s that China established a modern copyright system. They invented the printing machine, they invented the paper, but they did not recognize the concept of copyright until 1980s. So that shows how this concept has been alien to the Eastern concept. I'll make my presentation short because we are running out of time. So the other factors that have contributed to weak enforcement of intellectual property rights are, now it's basically against the Buddhist beliefs, and also the complexities and difficulties peculiar to this particular concept of intellectual property. You can't identify that concept called intellectual property in par with another property right. So I have given one example there. Then the aspect of international pressure, as I mentioned earlier, the TRIPS agreement is the adherence to the TRIPS agreement by the countries is not a voluntary act. It's a imposition, or it's kind of a compulsion by the developing nations. So that has also become a contributing factor towards the weak enforcement of intellectual property rights in Sri Lanka. So what's the conclusion? So basically, as Professor William Alford of Oxford University, laws premised on the values and institutions of economically advanced Western countries will not generate identical results when transferred to a different setting. So that is applicable to Sri Lanka. Another thing, laws should reflect the general will of the people, which is not the case in the case of intellectual property law in Sri Lanka, which we have introduced out of fear of trade bargain and sanction. So it is the function of the policymakers to create a delicate balance in order to protect the interest of the trade partners and investors who are coming to Sri Lanka, as well as to protect the interest of the Sri Lankans in the country. Thank you.
මේක මට කමෙන්ට් කරන්න